So hey guys, this week we're going to be looking at our PFD and we're going to be adding the touchscreen capabilities. Now once again, you don't have to make a PFD, you can also use this if you want to use a touchscreen like I've done. It's a very generic red one. They are great for something like this. Don't go watch a movie on it because it's not that great. But for an application like this, it has easy touch support. Could you do this with an Arduino? I think you can, but it's not going to be a pleasant experience, especially updating the screen, registering everything. I'd recommend to go something a little bit more beefy like an ESP32, TNZ or an STM. Lately I haven't been using anything else than ESP32 because I think it's the perfect balance between price point, ease of use, Wi-Fi capabilities, all sorts of stuff. Very, very powerful compared to an Arduino. So I'd highly recommend to go with that one. But before we get code anything up, we first need to know how a screen like this works, so we know how we can implement the logic behind it. There are three technologies that are the main front of touchscreen devices. We have surface acoustic wave screens. The moment you touch it, the signal gets disrupted, and that's how it determines where you've touched it. Secondly, we have what everyone is probably familiar with, is the capacitive touchscreen. If we touch it with our fingers, because we are electrical conductive, we touch the screen is conductive. It knows where it's pressed, because we disrupt the electrical field. Now, they are mostly used in your phone, smartphones, especially higher end touchscreens. And you can easily recognize them by touching them with a glove on. If you don't have those special fingertips, so it's just a non-conductive glove, if you touch touchscreen and it works, it probably isn't a capacitive touchscreen. It most likely is a resistive touchscreen. Now, resistive touchscreens work a little bit like this. We have a piece of proofing board and we have a bits and droid sticker that come with every order on the website. If we have a layer here and we have a sticker on top, you see that we have a gap of air in between. The moment we touch it in the middle, it makes contact with the layer below, and by cross-referencing the axes, it knows where it's touched. It's a little bit like a voltage divider, just in the touchscreen. This technology is cheaper. It doesn't mean it's bad. In hospitals it's apparently used as well because it can withstand liquids very well, it can withstand other contaminants very well. You can use it with styluses, all kinds of applications, and that's the one that we're going to be using. It's also cheaper than all the other options, so that is why you usually see it on lower end screens as well. So our code is growing quite rapidly, and because I want to keep things a little bit more tidy, a bit more clear for you guys, I'm going to split it up in just a separate file. If you want to, when you already have some elements on your screen and you want to implement the touch functionalities, just take the same approach to the code that I do to a new file and just paste it into your own existing file. In the description, I'll put a link to the article on my website where I'll show you how I've implemented everything in my own PFD screen, so you can subtract and kind of analyze where I place something, so you know where you can place something for yourself. But for now, we're going to be starting with a clean new sketch. Three libraries that we're going to be using is the SPA.h, the TFT_ESPI.h, and the Bits and Droids Fly32.h. We're using a ESP32, and if you're searching for a full in-depth video on how you can draw elements on your screen, go check out another link on the description that I put down there for my previous video. So I'm going to go through the drawing of the elements quite quickly. Let's start by adding in TFT.ESPI object, and we do the same for the Bits and Droids Fly32 library. There we go. So now we've got an object for a TFT and an object for our library. Now in the setup, we need to start our serial, which we're going to be using for debugging, 115200, and to send commands to the game if we want to. And we're going to be doing TFT.setRotation1 because we use a screen in a horizontal position, and in default it's in portrait mode. TFT.init because we want to initialize it. Now that's all there is to it for now. Now the library draws shapes, squares, rectangles, circles, but we're going to be using a rectangle with rounded corners. It's going to be a rounded rectangle. Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking about, but to make things easier and to bundle our shapes, we're going to create a struct for this, which we've done before as well, but if you haven't followed along, rounded square, there we go, is going to be integer x starting point integer width, integer y starting point, integer height. We're going to give it a corner radius, so the radius of the corners, how round you want them to be. Corner radius. We're going to give it a color. And that leaves us with the action. What are we going to do? Now we take a shape. It has a X starting position and a Y starting position, so we know where it begins. We want to see if it's in between the physical of the visual border of that button. So we can create a square around it. If it's in that area, we want to trigger our command. That is why I've added the command variable towards a struct, so that we know if we check if it's between the boundaries of this button, we also directly know which command is linked to the button as well, so we can trigger it. To keep things simple, we're going to just continuously check if the screen is touched. But to keep the loop function clean, we're going to create a new function for this. So we're going to say check touch. Now we don't have a check touch function yet, so we're going to create one. It's going to be a void. It's not going to return anything. I'm going to call it check touch, so it matches. It doesn't take anything as a parameter. And we're going to apply our logic in here. Now the TFT ESP library makes use of a coordinate system to draw things, but also a coordinate system to register touch. So what we need to add is a int with a defined width of 16, underscore t, here we go, t underscore x is 0, t underscore y is 0 as well. Now this is going to contain the touch coordinates depending on where it's touched. We're going to be using this cross-reference if those coordinates are within the boundaries of our visual. But to demonstrate things, let's add 2 buttons to it. So we say rounded square button A is, so I've just I swapped around the X start and I swapped around the Y start and the width just to keep things concise with the rest of my code. So keep that in mind. But I just copied and pasted the contents of the one that I'm using in my main code. It uses a reference point of a margin, so I'm going to add that as well. Here we go. Perfect. Here we go. So now we've got our first button. It starts at 20. Oh no, it starts at 30. It starts the Y position at 20, has a width of 100. 50 high, 4 corner radius. This is the color in 16 bytes decimal. It has 16-bit decimal format, and it's going to trigger the command set to G1000 menu button. I'm just going to copy this. Here we go. Button B. I've created a second button which triggers the send G1000 flight plan, and it takes the button A as a reference point to position itself. But at least now we've got 2 buttons with a. Now, so far we have been talking about a kind of an area with boundaries on where we want to register a touch. Well, with this object, we can see, let's take this one for example, it starts at 20. So if the touch is lower than 20, we know that we are somewhere on the left side of the button. If it's bigger than 20, we know that it's either in between the boundaries of the button or it's over the boundary of the button, somewhere on the far right of the screen. So what we need to check if it's bigger than the starting point, and if it's lower than the starting point plus the width. So that gives a nice little column to check against. If it's in between those values, our X coordinates, we know that the X coordinate of the touch is somewhere in that column where the button is as well. That doesn't tell us enough because the button doesn't fill the entire screen. We still have other elements in there as well. So we need to do the same thing for the height. So we take the Y starting point, which gives us the top line. If we then add the height, we get the bottom line. So if it's lower than the height, bigger than the starting point, we know that it's in between that row, column, and we're done. So that's what we're going to do, check touch. But first, now we have a tft.getTouch function, and what we need to pass it is the address of the X and Y coordinates that we defined on top. So the address of X and Y. There is a big chance that you haven't encountered this because it's a little bit more of an in-depth topic. So I'm trying to give you a quick overview on what a pointer is and what an address is, so at least you know what is happening. Now, at one point or another, when you're working with C++, or especially with Arduinos, TNGs, STMs, embedded systems overall, you're going to encounter the term pointers. And it can be something that can be quite daunting when you're just starting out with coding, or if you come from a more higher level of language like Java, C#, Python especially. Things like pointers aren't really that commonly used, so they might be new or daunting at first. At least they were for me, so I'm gonna admit that fully. This was like black magic until I kind of explained it myself like I was 5, so I'm gonna try to do the same with you guys. I'm not gonna go into the nitty-gritty of how it exactly works. I just want to show you what a pointer is, what an address is, and how it's used in coding. That's something really simple, like creating an integer and giving it a value. What happens at a lower level is that somewhere at a physical memory address or variable is stored. So let's see it like a house or a shop. Each house and shop can contain a value, but to know where that value is stored, that shop or house also has a house number. Just like if you and I receive a package, a new component comes in, the mailman knows where to deliver the package by the house number and the street name. In coding, we also have something like this that we call the memory address. Now, pointers are pointing towards an address. So if we take 3 shops and we give each of them a number, in this case 1578, 1579 and 1580, if we now create our integer a is equal to 25, what happens is that we store it somewhere in one of these shops. In this case, we stored a is 25 in 1579. And if we would create a new integer that's called b is equal to a, we would create a new integer that's stored at 1580. That has the value that's the same as a, going to be 25. So we copied that value and stored that in b. Now what we also could do is create a variable int asterisk c, so a new value c, is equal to %a. Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. The asterisk in the type declaration tells us that c is going to be a pointer to an address that holds an integer. So int asterisk c represents the address of a. So that's the ampersand. It tells us we retrieve the address of a. So what happens is that in 1578, we now store the address of a, which is going to be 1579. Now, because we only store the address here, if you would do int b is c without an asterisk, we would reference the address of a, because that's stored at c. If we would do b is c with an asterisk in front, it tells us that b is the value that's stored at the address at c. So in c, we've got the address 1579, which refers to a. So 1579, which holds the value 25. So b is asterisk c would give us the value 25. Now, when you're working with C++, I wouldn't recommend to replace everything that you've known with pointers and addresses, and it can really complicate your code, make it harder to maintain, hard to understand, especially when you're just starting out. So I'd say only use them when you really need to. Now, on a microcontroller like a TNG or whatever you want to use, STM, Arduino. Now, on microcontrollers, it's a kind of a different story. It's because they are memory limited, they are power limited, RAM limited, etc. Memory management can sometimes give you a better advantage. Now, it's one thing to implement it ourselves, but luckily a lot of libraries that we import and that we use have already thought about this memory allocation themselves, implemented where we want to use pointers, and just let you pass an address, for example. Now, What I hope this is achieved is that if you use one of these libraries, so in our case, let's say the TFT ESPI library that we're using for our radio with touchscreen, etc. At some point, it's going to ask for an address. At least now you know what it asks for and how it basically works under the hood. It's not black magic anymore. You know what happens, and later down the road, you will hit a point that you're like, now I get it. I understand it, but at least now when you see it, you know I recognize it. And that's the first step into learning something, that you're going to be like, oh, I recognize what they're doing. And at a later point, you can understand why they're doing it. So I hope it gave you a little bit of a starting point and made the subject a little bit more tangible. So now we got that out of the way. We want the address, so to do ampersand t underscore x and ampersand t underscore y. So now we pass it the address of the x and the y. And in this library, if you look it up, if you open the library, you go to the getTouch function, you notice that they have this kind of way to detect if it's a valid touch. So if it's in between the boundaries, if it's not lower than some kind of cutoff point, etc. So no noise on there. If that's true, we return the value. We store the touch coordinates in those addresses we gave. If it's not true, so it's an invalid touch, it returns false. So what we say is if tft.getTouch, so if it's not false, so if it's true, so if it's a valid touch, we do something. And if that's the case, then the coordinates are saved in the top coordinates that we defined right here. So these now contain apparently our valid touches. So what we then can do is if t underscore x is bigger than, let's say, button a dot x start, so it's the starting point, and t underscore x is also smaller than button a dot x start plus the width. So now we created our button a dot width, sorry. Button a dot width. So now we've created our first imaginary boundary that I've mentioned, a starting point and an end point. So that gives us a column. So we also need to know switches to ends. There is probably better ways to do this, but at least makes it clear for me. The t underscore y, so the y coordinate is bigger than the button a dot y start, and t underscore y, or perhaps you already guessed it, is smaller than button a dot y start plus button a dot height. So now we got our imaginary column and our imaginary row. If it's in between those coordinates, we know it's somewhere in the button. Now if you want to, I don't know, a little bit of error margin, basically a very small button, but you have lots of space around it, so if you press it, you want it to also register as a button touch, you could add some, I don't know, right here, +10, add some in with the height, so you get a little bit of a bigger touching point in the touch box, you know, where it registers the valid press for the button, even though it's not precisely on there. You can do two things. This is fine and this works, but if we want to check for the other button, we could you know, add another one if statement if button b dot x start is bigger, and we keep on yada yada yada. But that's not really handy because when we start just keep repeating ourselves. So let's say we create a rounded square button array, and it's going to contain button A and button B. Now you can do this for all the buttons that you have, all the elements that you want to put in there, as long as they are rounded squares. And we just add them in one array. What we now can do is where we've got if button A, button A, button A, button A, etc., we can create a for loop. So we say for, and there are two ways to do this. Int I is 0. I is smaller than size of button array, divided by size of button array and then the first elements. Here we go. Y plus plus. Okay, here we go. Something like this. This works fine. Totally valid. Another option might be for auto address of the button in button array. Now what does this do? Now we take the button array and we can get every value from each element one by one, and it just iterates through each one of them, which we can call by the name button. So here in our previous example, we had to do button array I, which is fine, valid, works. But with the above one, we could do button.xStart, button.xStart, button.xWidth, button.YStart, button, and button. Now you could even shorten this to, I don't know, B, and then just do B to just make your code a little bit more smaller and readable. But it's up to you. There's also a point to be made that this is more clear. Now what does this do? It just takes each element in an array, checks if it's bigger or smaller, higher or lower to determine those boundaries, and then we do connector.send button.command. So now we take the element from the array. If it's in between his own borders, it's a valid touch that we've touched that button. We then trigger the command that is associated with that element. And that is actually a very... and that's basically all there is to it. To register a touch, we check if it's a valid touch. If that's the case, do something. Now, I also did some differentiation by saying if mode is equal to GPS or something, so all kinds of different screens, then check this array, then check this array, then check this array. But that's all up to you, whatever you want to do. And you can, the code that I've added and that I've finished up with can be optimized and the code that I've ended up with and that I'm going to put on the website is far from the ideally optimized code, but I hope it's a little bit more understandable of what is happening instead of how well it's happening. And then we can later on look at how we can improve things down the road. Now, one thing important to note is that I forgot that I put an equal sign here, which shouldn't be here. So a struct doesn't have an equal sign after its name. And I've added a little function to just draw the elements actually on the screen because I forgot that as well. But if we do this, we are going to be getting a view which looks like this. But one thing to notice is if you now open the serial monitor, here we go, and we press the button, nothing happens. If we press it down here, here we go. Something happens all of a sudden. See right here, and then above here, nothing happens. Now, why is that the case? Well, by default, the TFT ESPI library assumes that you use the screen in a portrait mode, so standing up. That means that then the coordinates are also kind of skewed. Because we flip the screen once, it updates the drawing coordinates, but for some reason it doesn't update the touch coordinates. Now, there's probably a way to calibrate this in the library, but just to, we can do this ourselves as well. Now, our screen has 320 on the top right now and 0 at the bottom, which is fine. We want that flipped. So what we then do is 320 minus the t_y. So now we just flip it. If we draw something, the top is 0, and if we touch something, the top is 320. So what we then do is we take 0, where now our touch is registered, and we add the 320 minus the touch where it's registered, which gives us the proper orientation and the proper coordinates. So right now, if I save this and we hit upload, we can see that if we touch the buttons again, all will be well. Now, if we once again take a look at the screen and the serial monitor, of course. Yep, there we go. We see that now if we touch it on the button, we actually get a command, and over there as well. Now we can do two things to check. Now, some of you are going to say, Dave, don't add delays, and you are completely right, but to keep things very simple, right now I'm going to add a delay. Why is the case is you see what happens here. If we touch the button, it keeps registering that press and it keeps sending the command. So I'm guessing you don't want to keep sending a certain command to the game constantly. So it's more ideally that if we press it, we have some time to actually release the screen and send the command, so it doesn't get triggered multiple times. So that is something for you to. Now you can also play around with this. Up this, I believe my fingers are quite slow apparently because I need quite a high value. You can use some timers to avoid the delay. There are all kinds of possibilities to streamline this instead of using delay, but to keep things simple and as a starting point, I'm going to show you how to do it like this. And right now, if we upload this once again, you'll see that if we touch the button and release it, it's way more stable. Okay, here we go. Let's hit it. Yeah, you see now it only triggers once. I believe delay is a little bit too high, but if we wait long enough, it works. So play around with this, add this to your own code, add your own elements. At least now you know how it works and how you can implement it for yourself. This is especially handy for those of you that are using those relatively. This is especially handy for those of you that use those relatively low-cost screens from AliExpress or something that have the touchscreen integrated. It's really not that hard, and the TFT ESPI library takes care of most of the work for you. Now, could you do this also with an Arduino? I think you can, and perhaps even with a Mega. Uno would really be stretching it unless you use a really small TFT screen. So I'd really suggest to get something beefier. Teensy, ESP32. Teensy is a absolute beast, but price-wise, the ESP32, I don't know, STM32 as well, absolute beast. A little bit harder to program because you actually need kind of ST-Link and a programmer, which is fine. It's not that difficult. So if you don't feel intimidated, just know that it's a little bit of an extra step. ESP32 is just plug and play, add the board from the board manager, and you're fine to go. So I'd highly recommend one of those. To be quite honest, I haven't been using anything else lately. ESP32 is for the win. I'm going to be checking out the STM32 as well. Yeah, just very good boards. Now, for those of you that are waiting for a little bit more of a hands-on build guide, the landing gear lever is almost done. It's going to be mounted on my honeycomb Javo yoke. It doesn't look pretty done. I agree with you. It looks very low quality right now, but trust me, it's going to be amazing. We've also got a little nice teamed lever in here, which doesn't fit, so I'm really hoping that I haven't painted this stuck towards this mechanism. But that's something that's coming up. Took a little bit while, took quite some iterations, but I think I finally got it where I wanted. So thank you very much for watching. A special thank you to all the patrons who make all this content possible. I've also been working on a new updates. As you can clearly see, master warning, master caution, they work right now. Just send the on and off command, but it doesn't turn on the LED, which will be happening next, coming up something. Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Most of all, I hope to see you in the next one.